What? Breakfast? Come on. Let's have breakfast.
Show me how to live life. So tell me what you're thinking of.
Are you or someone you know struggling with social anxiety? Then stick around because in this episode of the Mental Health Toolbox, we're talking about the difference between social anxiety and shyness and when to seek help. So let's go. Hello, Thrivers, and welcome back to the Mental Health Toolbox. It can be difficult to distinguish the difference between social anxiety and shyness. So let's break down the difference. And just a reminder that this content is not medical advice nor a treatment plan. It is intended for entertainment and general education purposes only and should not be used as a means to self-diagnose or self-treat any health, medical, or physical condition. If you need a professional, you should get one. So let's go. Okay, so let's start off by talking about what social anxiety is. According to the Mayo Clinic, social anxiety disorder includes fear, anxiety, and avoidance that interfere with relationships, daily routines, work, school, or other activities. Social anxiety disorder typically begins in the early to mid-teens, though it can sometimes start in younger children or adults. So, the important thing here is to take note of the fact that social anxiety, if we're looking at it as a disorder, interferes with your life. It's not something that is just inconvenient or that causes you to drag your feet a little bit. It is something that causes disruption or an arrested kind of development in your life stages. Social anxiety is also sometimes referred to as social phobia, which sounds a little more to the point, right? And that's because it is literally a fear, an intense fear of social engagement. And we're going to talk a little more about that and why that's the case. When we're talking about social anxiety as a disorder, it's important to remember that this is more than just a panic disorder. There are a lot of different types of anxiety. There's generalized anxiety, there's agoraphobia, with panic attacks, there's panic disorder, there's social anxiety, and then there's some ancillary other types of anxiety disorders that we're not going to dive into right now. But when you think about social anxiety, I want you to think about anticipatory anxiety. It's this incredible discomfort that comes with anticipating a social engagement, interaction, context, usually wherein the person fears being judged. There's usually a lot of fear that encompasses that and how they're going to be perceived by their peers, or even that their anxiety will be noticeable in the room, which brings about its own kind of anxiety. It's this vicious feedback loop, right? When distinguishing the difference between a social anxiety disorder or shyness, it's important that we really look at the criteria so that we don't pathologize something that is just part of a personality or context, right? We want to make sure that if we're going to label something as an impairment, we're very clear about what makes it an impairment, the criteria. Okay, and what helps us do that are manuals like the DSM. DSM-5 is the most recent, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. And so we're just going to walk through a few of the criteria that it outlines in order to meet a diagnosis. Now, that being said, just because you can check these boxes does not make it a diagnosis. That needs to come from a professional mental health clinician, okay, that you're working closely with. But this is just some general guidance in terms of trying to use that discernment to ask yourself, should I seek help for this, or is this just a life phase that I'm working through? Okay, and so let's take a look at that for a second. So the DSM lists several criteria that must be met in order to even consider a diagnosis. The first of which is a marked fear or anxiety about one or more social situations in which the individual is exposed to possible scrutiny by others. So again, that emphasizes the anticipatory anxiety of being judged by one's peers, one's authorities, depending on what age. Could be a child to a parent, could be a teen or adult to a peer. Lots of different context here. The second criteria states that the social situations almost always provoke fear or anxiety. Now, this isn't just sometimes. This isn't just at birthday parties or particular events. This is almost all social engagements provoke anxiety or fear. Okay? The third criteria states that fear or anxiety is out of proportion to the actual threat posed by the social situation and to the social cultural context. So what this is saying is that it's irrational. It's taking something that might be stressful under normal circumstance and taking it to the extreme, right? It's jumping out of proportion to what the context would be for the average person in terms of the fear and anxiety, angst, and discomfort that would come within that type of social situation. Life is full of stressful situations, and anxiety is a normal, healthy response. It's one of our prime emotions, and it serves us, right? And it teaches us, what to pay attention to, and we all struggle with self-doubt and imposter syndromes, here and there, different points of our life, but social anxiety is out of the ballpark of what would be considered a normal type of reaction. The next criteria states that social situations are avoided or endured with intense fear or anxiety. So we're not just talking about an inconvenience or, choosing something else to do just because it's not that important. What we're saying, great extremes will be taken in order to avoid or minimize these types of feared interactions. Someone will go to great lengths to isolate or avoid or evade the necessity to be in an uncomfortable anticipated situation. And that will obviously create problems in life because we can't always avoid social situations. It's, part of being human. And in order to make one's way in life and hit your social milestones and your development and career milestones and educational milestones, social interaction is unavoidable. And it's a healthy thing because we are social beings. We're designed to be social. And so social anxiety robs us of almost the privilege of engaging with our peers and being relatable and relating to others and growing with others and sharing experiences. And so it's a very devastating type of disorder because it robs us of the privilege of participating in life in this shared human experience. The next criteria states that the fear, anxiety, or avoidance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So going back to this notion of activities of daily living, in mental health, clinicians will look for impairments in one of these three areas: work, school, and relationships, right? And if one of those are taking a big hit, that's usually a big red flag that something is clinically not right in terms of something's not working. Doesn't mean that we're pathologizing the person, but it means that something is not working, something is getting in the way of this person's growth and development, and we need to address it, or it's going to be very hard for that person to progress toward their goals and creating a life of meaning and purpose according to their own definition. And this next one is a big one, and it's something I want you to remember whenever you're looking at yourself and asking yourself, is this a problem, right? We're talking about duration, okay? And the DSM says another criterion is whether the fear, anxiety, or avoidance is persistent and is typically lasting for 6 months or more, right? We need to give experience time, right? We need to give ourselves time to wade through our emotions and go through the discomfort of change to know if our reactions are, I guess, reasonable according to the social norms, and our development. If that what we're experiencing is a typical growth process, or if we're stuck, right? And there's a difference. If we're stuck and it's generally lasting more than 6 months, and we can't seem to get through this developmental hurdle, be it anxiety or depression or some other cognitive issues, then it's important to consider seeking help, right? Because if we're not able to get ourselves unstuck, it's probably time to ask for help, okay? Otherwise, we might just be looking at an adjustment, right? And everybody needs an adjustment. New job, new relationships, change, transitions, grief and loss. Life is full of change. Change is a constant. But with any big change, even milestones, even good change, it's really, really, really important that we give ourselves like 6 months to a year to really adjust and get our bearings and go through the emotions and motions of life. Okay, just keep that in mind. Okay, this next criterion is important to consider because we don't want to necessarily pathologize something that is possibly a product of another problem, right? We want to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture here. The DSM says the fear, anxiety, or avoidance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, such as drug abuse or a medication, or another medical condition. So then it's important to consider the fact that if somebody has a co-occurring issue, right, a co-occurring problem such as substance abuse, and they're struggling with dependence or abuse of a mood-altering substance like methamphetamine or other drugs or alcohol, that alone could muddy the water in terms of mental health. And it's important to make sure that we are cleaning the slate and getting the right treatment to address that identifiable problem, be it substance abuse or otherwise, before we can start labeling a mental health diagnosis like social anxiety, right? So we want to make sure that we're not getting our wires crossed or jumping the gun in that regard. It also mentions medical conditions, right? And that could be a number of things, but could be a physical ailment that causes one to be self-conscious. It could be obesity. It could be things that create inconvenience in social situations that make it hard to adapt to social norms. And so that can create its own kind of anxiety and fear of judgment by general others. And that doesn't mean it's irrational. That would be a very irrational fear, especially if that person has been subject to fear and ridicule because of those issues. Make sense? Okay, and this next one, it goes back to what we were mentioning earlier, which is to make sure that we're looking at the right type of anxiety. The DSM says the fear, anxiety, or avoidance is not better explained by the symptoms of another mental disorder, such as panic disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, or an autism spectrum disorder. This is really important because we want to make sure that we are being tried and true with what we're looking at, and we're not skating past something else that makes more sense, right? Panic disorder, for example, is generally the fear of panic attacks creates panic attacks, but it has a different flavor to it in a different context than social anxiety disorder, right? And that's all we're talking about here. It's just making sure that we're considering the differential diagnosis and other options that can come along with that, okay? Because sometimes they look very similar until we look at the nuances of what's going on. And sometimes there's the exception to the rule. So this next criterion talks a little bit about that. It says if another medical condition, such as Parkinson's disease, obesity, disfigurement from burns, or an injury, is present, the fear then, or the anxiety or avoidance, is clearly unrelated or is excessive. Meaning that that person has either made peace with their disability or has learned to function in spite of their disability, and the social anxiety they do have is not related to that. Or that the people who know them the best would say, oh no, that person, yeah, they've had burn scars their whole life, and they've been to therapy for that, or they've been to burn camps and they've processed it, and that's not the problem. This social anxiety thing is different, or it's new. Or it's in such an extreme that it's even not explainable by that other condition, right? And that can be a little tricky, and oftentimes one will have to consult with collateral contacts, family, friends, in order to get kind of the full scope or picture of what's going on there. And there's one other little caveat when we're looking at the criterion here, and that is that if the fear is restricted to speaking or performing in public, that's not to say it's not a social anxiety, it's just a very specific type of social anxiety. And the DSM does make an exception for that this would be more of a performance social anxiety, right? Okay. Moving on. So that's social anxiety. So let's look at the other spectrum here and look at shyness and some connotations and ideas about what shyness is as opposed to jumping straight to social anxiety. Okay? So when I think of shyness or being timid, I think of this as a personality trait that's not necessarily accompanied by or with negative emotions or connotations, as though there is some pathology to it, right? And that's really the difference here, is that shyness is a personality trait, social anxiety is an impairment. I want you to be really clear about that, okay? And by that I mean shyness does not interfere with those activities of daily living we talked about, the occupational, academic, or social aspects of one's life. And think of it this way. Shyness is oftentimes front-loaded, meaning that one might have a timid or shy personality, but once they break the ice or they acclimate to the environment and they get their bearings, then they're able to engage more, they're not as self-conscious, they are more confident in their role. Doesn't mean they're going to be like the outgoing life of the party, but it means that they drop their guard, they feel more comfortable in their own skin after they've got their feet wet a little bit into a new experience or routine. That being said, shyness in general is manageable and it lessens with exposure, right? The more exposure, the less shy or timid one would seem. Doesn't mean they're not timid or shy or self-conscious. It just means they are less bothered or it's less apparent as they get more exposure. When I think of this notion, I think of my own experience having worked at Denny's, right, through college. I worked the graveyard shift and I was a waiter. And the interesting thing is I myself was very shy and timid going into that world, right, being a young adult and having kind of an orthodox childhood. I didn't have a whole lot of social exposure in the normal context. And so when I joined the workforce at 18, I started as a kitchen scrub. And then as I moved into a waiter position, I was a little worried, what are they going to think about me? How, am I going to be judged by my peers? And, it didn't take long before I hit the ground running. I went from host to waiter in a matter of weeks. And then I was very comfortable and very excited to go to work. And I saw the same thing happen to, with a lot of my peers that would come on. But every once in a while, in particular, I would see a coworker come on board who was extremely shy. And I can think of a few easily. And sure enough, though, after 6 months, 7 months, 8 months of working as a hostess or a host or a waiter, that I saw that person develop into a more confident character just through the lived experience of being in a job where they had forced people interactions, were part of a team, but had very set roles and expectations and routine. And it wasn't long before they were very comfortable and became more outgoing. Did that mean, again, that they were the life of the team and they were the charismatic ones? No, but there was a definite difference in their presentation as they got comfortable with the people and the job and their role. That makes sense? Now, because shyness is a personality trait, it's important to think about it in terms of just a trait, okay? People can still be introverts or even extroverts and be shy or timid. A shy introvert may prefer to still kind of be a homebody, by themselves mostly, or a very small social circle. A shy or timid extrovert may not necessarily want to be a homebody, and once they get familiar with their group of people and they feel comfortable, become much more lively, right? Or might be very outgoing with a handful of people. They just like their world or their bubble to stay contained. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're shy all the time, or that one can't be an extrovert just because they're shy. And that's a very important distinction to make. All right, so when you are trying to discern whether or not you are personally struggling with a social anxiety or just a shyness or timid personality, I would have you ask yourself this. Is your anxiety preventing you from doing what you want to be doing and what you enjoy? That is key. Because if somebody is shy and timid or an introvert, they actually prefer that lifestyle. If you have social anxiety and you want to be doing more, but you can't because you get too worked up, that's your indication that maybe you need to take a closer look and maybe seek help, just in case. And you also want to be asking yourself, is your anxiety or shyness interfering with progress toward your goals, right? Not just living the life you want, but is your progress halted or do you feel stuck? That's another big red flag, okay? You should be asking yourself if do I have panic attacks? Because that's a pretty obvious red flag. And if you don't know what a panic attack is, it's very, very, very uncomfortable. For some, it can feel like a heart attack. Usually your heart's pounding. We call that heart palpitations. Shortness of breath, very shallow breathing. Some people feel very numb or even detached. Call it depersonalization or derealization. They might get very cold or very hot. Those are just dizzy. Those are some examples of what can come along with a panic attack. And that's a very strong fear-based reaction that your body's going into as a means of survival because it feels threatened. And that's a big red flag for anxiety in general and should be looked at more closely. All right, we talked about impairments and ADLs. Just remember that, if you're ever wondering if you have a social anxiety, ask yourself, is it interfering with my job performance, my school performance, or my relationships on any significant level, okay? All right, and if you have concluded that maybe you struggle with a social anxiety or anxiety disorder, what are some things you can do to help recover or address that? All right, so let's touch on that for a second. The first thing that comes to mind would be cognitive behavioral therapy counseling, right? Because we know that anxiety is fear-based, and so some time would be spent looking at your thought process and your assumptions and your rules and what's contributing to that anxiety response, right? So that's best addressed in therapy or counseling. It's also important to note, though, that if you have a history of trauma, be that complex trauma, simple trauma, developmental trauma, that CBT alone is probably not enough. That some trauma work will need to be done in order to kind of dive a little bit deeper than just what CBT can touch on in order to kind of figure out where that's coming from, okay? And recovering from a social anxiety or anxiety in general, I would have you remember that all behavior is meaningful and functional and serves a purpose of some sort, be it that purpose is to protect you, right? It may not always be advantageous, but it is your body or mind's way of trying to keep you safe. And so it's important to not get too down on yourself or shame yourself or feel bad or guilty or that something is wrong with you. It's really just your body's attempt at protecting you. And it's important then to have self-compassion, self-love, and create some space for looking at that, but not from a self-shaming type of way. All right. When it comes to anxiety or anxiety disorders, oftentimes habituation work is a strategy or intervention that a counselor will use in order to minimize the anxiety response. And so if you have a counselor, maybe talk about habituation work as something to add to your agenda and coping skill and toolbox in order to better cope with your anxiety. And habituation work is basically exposure therapy, but on very incremental steps. And so that basically the idea is that you're increasing your distress tolerance little by little and not biting off more than you can chew and not staying stuck. So it's kind of a a baby step plan, and it's very effective. So maybe take a look at that if you are struggling with an anxiety disorder. And since we're on the subject, if you do feel like you would like to find a therapist, but you don't know how, be sure that you're familiar at least with the process of finding a therapist. Because one of my biggest pet peeves with managed care system is that it's not always easy to access care when you're ready, right? If somebody's ready to ask for help, and then it takes them months and months to get in somewhere, or they don't know where to start, and then they don't know how to leverage their insurance, etc. It can be very overwhelming, and that person will oftentimes give up before they even start to work on their anxiety. So familiarize yourself with the process of finding a therapist if you decide you want to, or a coach, or whatever works for you. I will put a link to a tutorial I put out for that specific purpose in the description if you want to check that out. All right, another method for recovering from social anxiety is learning to get over the spotlight effect. Spotlight meaning that you assume that when you walk into a room that everybody's eyes are on you and that they are judging you, when in reality, most people are way too egocentric to be even giving you more than 8 seconds of their mental energy. And I'm not being mean about that. I just mean that most people are self-centered by nature. We all are. We are all concerned with our own thoughts and what other people are thinking of us. So we're really generally not spending a whole lot of mental energy judging other people. Okay. And so that's a good thing for you if you have social anxiety, to remember that when you think somebody's thinking about you, they're probably not. And so if you want somebody's attention, you generally really have to work for it. Okay. So that should be some kind of relief for you. Just keep that in mind. Okay. All right, just a couple more things on this subject of recovering from social anxiety that I would have you focus on your actions and not outcomes. Focus on what you have control over, because with anxiety, it's very easy to get attached to outcomes and married to the idea of what should be as opposed to what we have control over, right? James Clear is an author on behavior and behavior modification. I really like his book, and he talks a lot about this in his book, Atomic Habits. So if you haven't checked it out, it's a good one to read on this subject of your thought process and what is advantageous for you to focus on versus not, and how to minimize anxiety in that regard. Really helpful stuff. All right, one last thought here in talking about general skills for recovering from anxiety is to think about whether you struggle more in one-to-one versus group settings, and in particular, what kind of pain point are you struggling with in terms of the context. And if you can identify that, that'll give you a point of intervention to work with, right? For example, if you struggle with anxiety when you run out of things to say in a social context, that is something you can work on specifically that'll help you feel more confident moving forward, that you can practice and practice and practice, and then just be mindful of when other things come up to take note of that when you see specific cues or triggers to your anxiety in social context, right? And this is important because when you have significant behavior identified, you can target that behavior for change, right? Toward a more positive outcome. This goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about the difference between actions and outcomes. If you're focusing on what you have control over, such as your personal reactions to things or how you engage or respond to other people, then you're going to feel empowered, and you'll understand that life is more malleable than maybe you're giving it credit for. Okay, and this goes hand in hand with learning to challenge your rules and assumptions, very CBT type stuff. Again, you can work with a counselor or a coach on that. Okay, hope that was helpful. All right, so here's my question for you. What aspect of social anxiety do you struggle with the most? And what aspect would you like to learn more about? So be sure to let me know if you have any requests for topics or other questions, Q&A. Feel free to use the Contact Me form or the SpeakPipe link in the description for Q&A, comments, questions, and I'll be sure to add that to my content calendar and hopefully add more value to you. Okay? Interpersonal effectiveness happens to be a passion of mine. It's probably one of my favorite subjects in mental health and personal development. And if you would like to learn more about social anxiety, I'm actually working on a mini course right now on the very subject. If you want to know when that comes out and when it's available, be sure to, if you haven't already, subscribe to the MHT newsletter. You can use the link in the description for that. Okay. And if you're into self-help books and self-paced type programs, you'll probably like this book on anxiety, the Anxiety and Worry Workbook by Dr. Beck and David Clark. It's a really nice self-paced handbook on coping skills for anxiety and based on CBT principles. So check that out. And if you want to find other books on mental health and personal development, I've curated some of my favorite on a list over at mhtgear.com. Feel free to check that out. Those are affiliate links, and purchases made earn a small commission fee that helps support this channel at no additional cost to you. So go ahead and check that out at your leisure, mhtgear.com. All right, there you have it. Another tool for you to thrive. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share this content, and that way it will reach more people and raise mental health awareness. Until next time, go make good things happen. Bye-bye.
You're gone now, will you call me back? Yeah, I know that. Yeah, I know that. You're the traveling